To talk today about the distance education participants and NRS requirements for assessment and identifying them and reporting them. Of course, in these times we are living in now, there's been a great increase in distance, the interest in this topic. So that was hence the webinar today. And last week you should have gotten a NRS tips that summarizes requirements. So before we get started, I'm going to ask Marcella to give you just a little walkthrough of some of the technical features of our webinar and the ways to ask questions and mute your phone and things like that. So Marcella?
Thanks, Larry. So as Larry said, and as I mentioned, for those of you who had joined a little bit earlier, at the top of your screen, you should see a telephone if you called in by telephone, or a microphone icon. If you click on that, specifically if you click on the arrow to the right of it, it gives you the option to mute my phone. And we ask that you do that to avoid any background noise. If you are on a telephone, if you called in, we ask that you also make sure that you are muted on your phone, just on the phone itself. And as we participate in today's call, we do want to hear from all of you. We want to make sure that we are able to answer all of your questions. So we want you to submit those at any time through the chat pod. You can use that both for content questions and to request technical assistance. But we're going to save those questions for the end, just to make sure that we're able to get through all of our content in time. And at the end of the session, we will go through all of the questions that were submitted. We'll also ask you to raise your hand. If you look at the top of your screen, there's also just a couple of icons over from that telephone or microphone that I mentioned earlier. There's a little person that you can click on the arrow to the right of that, and it will allow you to raise your hand. We can call on you so that you can ask your question. We will follow up with any unanswered questions that we were not able to either get to or weren't able to provide a complete answer to during this webinar. And we will have an evaluation that will pop up at the end of this webinar, and I'll make sure to put that in the chat as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Larry.
Okay, thanks, Marcella. And today I'm going to review all of the NRS requirements for reporting and defining distance learners. I would point out first that we first developed these procedures and methods in 2002, so they've been really part of the NRS for quite a long time. There's, of course, a couple of new things we'll talk about because of the pandemic that we'll talk about near the end. But everything else has been in place for a number of years. So this is a review, and it's all in the NRS guidelines with the exception of the new things which will be added within the next day or two. So we'll talk first about defining distance ed participants and determining status and compounding contact hours, how to assess distance education learners, including our new allowance of virtual testing. We'll summarize the reporting and policy recommendations and requirements, and then I'll review some of the exceptions for the COVID-19 exceptions that we have, and then we'll have I think we'll have plenty of time for questions, because and if we don't, as Marcella said, we'll follow up with you through email or another way. Can I move the slides? Okay, so let's start off with what is distance education. Now remember, this definition is kind of old. So we, when we did it, it's hard to believe, but we didn't have a whole computer software and computer applications were relatively new, and that wasn't widely used. So we've developed a definition that's extremely broad, which is basically, and it still applies today, that formal learning where instructors and students are separated by geography, time, or both for most of the instructional period. And these are the ways you can provide distance education instruction through, of course, computer, software, web-based programs, some type of online technology. You can use printed materials, audio, video, even broadcasts. So it's very, very, very broad. It's a separation of learner and student, and doing the instruction by some remote means, some virtual or printed or audio means, video, and also all the interaction or much of the interaction between the student and teacher is through distance methods. And that can be, again, computers, technology, software, email, telephone, and even snail mail. Let's say if you have a participant who has no internet access, for example. So any of those methods are allowable. So it's quite broad. And so then the question becomes, who's a distance ed participant? And that's any distance learning, one who receives, any participant who receives all or part of instruction through distance method. So the only tricky part to that is, what about participants who get both, who might do a blended learning experience or have, do distance for a while and then switch to classroom, or vice versa, as is typically happening right now. Some of your traditional classroom learners are now getting online instruction, so there's a switch. So how do you classify, how do you determine if the person's a distance ed participant? It's really left up to the state to make that determination. And in the past, what I've typically seen in the policies is that if a student is spending 50% or more of contact hours in one modality or the other, they are that type of participant. So if they're spending more time in distance applications, they're a distance learner, and at classroom, they're a classroom learner. But that is determined by you in your state policy, and that's one of the things you should, if you have a state policy, you define that. The other thing about distance ed participants is you only count them once. They're either a distance learner or they're not a distance learner, no matter how many POPs they are in. So even if, for example, they're in that, let's say they're a distance learning in one POP and not in the other, you have to call them one or the other and keep that designation throughout the year for the purposes of reporting. So they're only counted once, and they're only in the same status no matter what. And again, this should be all laid out in your policy about how to do that. Then, okay, so then you've got defined your participant as how do you, your individual, and how do you know if they're a participant? And like everybody else in adult ed, every other student, they're a participant when they have 12 hours of contact. But for distance learning, this contact can be any combination of in-person or virtual or telephone or email, any other virtual or online contact can be counted toward the 12 hours. And you don't have to have any individual in-person contact if that isn't possible, which is probably the case these days. So it isn't required that they be in person for those contact hours, but there has to be some kind of contact. And the key thing here is to make sure this is to have some method of verifying that the participant is who they say they are. So the participant identity must be verifiable. So once you've established that, you can count those, get those 12 hours any way you want through that combination. And you report those 12 hours in table 4, like all other learners, and in 4C, which is our breakout table for distance learners, if you're considering that person a distance learner. So it's pretty flexible for the first 12 hours. Now, the next issue is how do we count hours after the first 12 hours? And we have in the NRS optional reporting of that through a concept called proxy hours. Excuse me, I went too far ahead here. Proxy hours. So that is completely optional. So after the 12 hours, you can keep track of contact hours or not. It's up to your state policy to determine that. And you can use one you can use our models that we've defined in the NRS, which I'll go over in a minute, to do so. And we have three models that we've identified through past work in distance ed a number of years ago, which I think are still quite relevant. The only requirement we have with that is to make sure the model matches your curriculum that you're using, is appropriate for the curriculum. And again, Octave recommends a state distance learning policy that describes that curricula and the type of distance education that's provided and the models used for determining proxy hours for each type of curriculum. And so again, this is so you have some uniformity in your state and you can track those hours more accurately. And you report those proxy hours again in table 4 and 4C. But again, it is a optional requirement. It's not a requirement, it's an optional approach you may do or may not choose to do as a state. So here are the 3 models that we've identified in the NRS. One is a simple clock time model. Hours are just based on the time that you're working, the participant is working on the activity connected to the software, for example, or engaged somehow online. And of course, you've got to have software that permits that tracking of time, if that's what you're doing. Then we have what we call the verification model, which is also a very commonly used model where you're assigning hours of credit based on the assignments, and which is determined, and the teacher determines the extent to which the participant is engaged and completed the assignment. So you can have an assignment and say this takes about 5 hours or 10 hours or whatever, for example. The student she completes the assignment, and then you say, okay, the student now has 10 hours, or however you want to do that. And then the mastery model is based on passing test content for each lesson. So say you can break your software, your learning materials into certain, let's say, modules or segments, and there's a test at the end, and you think it takes 20 hours to do each segment. Student passes the test, and they get the 20 hours. So those are the 3 models, and you can use any model, combination of those models, as long as they're appropriate for the curriculum that you have chosen. And again, Octave asks that, or strongly recommends you have a policy in your state policy that defines that and describes that and the methods you use to come up with those hours. And again, remember, this is completely optional. Okay, so we know what distance learning is. We have a participant. We know what a distance learning participant is. We know how to count their hours or not, or if we want to. And now the issue of testing and MSG comes up. This is just a reminder that, of course, distance learning participants, you can report MSG for them in the same ways as all other participants. So they can be through an EFL gain, such as pre and post testing, credit completion, or entry into post-secondary after exit, and attainment of a recognized secondary credential. So any of these methods for MSG reporting can also be used for distance education. And of course, most of the time, or much of the time, like other learners, this is done through pre and post testing. So this is where we
Larry,
get into,
sorry, before...
Yes. Hello?
Larry?
Yes.
Yes, before you go on, somebody is playing music in the background. I'm going to ask everyone who is on the phone. Unfortunately, it seems that I'm not able to mute you. Specifically, it's an 803 phone number that we're having some trouble with. If you could please mute yourself, that would be appreciated so that we can hear what Larry is saying.
Thank you, Marcel. Yeah, it sounds like it went away. Okay, post-testing is the tricky part with distance learners, and that is something we've had a lot of questions about recently. First off, I'll say the same basic requirements for post-testing are in for distance learners, and that it means using a NRS-approved test, and that you test according to the number of hours that are the test publisher requires for post-testing. So the trick becomes, how do you determine the number of hours? And there's a few ways to do that. Of course, if you're using proxy hours, you can follow that approach. So then when, let's say it's 40 or 60 hours, student has 40 or 60 proxy hours, you can do the post-test. Another typical way is just calendar time. So you could say testing is every month, every 2 months. And you want to, if of course using that method, you want to ensure that enough time has passed for the hours to have been accrued by the individual. Yes, Marcella?
Larry, I'm going to mute all users, and you'll have to and I'll unmute you again to try to take care of this issue. I apologize to everyone.
Okay, are we back? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Larry.
Okay. Good, and the music has gone away and felt quiet. Thank you, Marcella. Sorry about that technical issue. Okay, post-testing again, you follow the same rules as far as using the NRS proof test, matching your different form from your pretest, and the hours should be according to the test publisher's guidelines, either calculated through proxy hours or some other method. Typically, that's calendar time. Again, that's something you would put in your state policy for assessment, is how you're determining post-testing time. And here's our new wrinkle we have is we did not permit this before, but now we permit virtual testing, of course, because of our inability these days to actually have the student come in and take a test. You can still do that, and hopefully soon we will be able to do that in the next coming months. So either you can have the participant come into a testing center or a program in person and take the post-test, or you can do a virtual test. And the virtual test is something new. First off, the test has to be an NRS approved test. And secondly, the publisher has established procedures for virtual testing. And this is, of course, something brand new. None of our approved tests had virtual testing, and they are now developing that. And some of them are, I believe, Best Plus has already come up with some guidelines for virtual testing. And other tests we've spoken to some publishers. We've had a few phone calls. They are working on these on requirements now. So what are the requirements that we would like to see, and which the test publishers are actively working on right now, is to do a virtual test. First off, you have to know that the person on the other side of the screen or the phone or whatever is the person that you want that person to be. So there has to be some way to identify in a strong way that you're talking to the participant, or the participant is taking the test. The next thing is, of course, test security is the biggest issue in virtual testing, because once you put that test out there online, the security is very difficult, because people can do various things like take screenshots or record the testing session. So the publisher procedures will address how they're maintaining security. Test proctoring by virtual means is different than online, and there's some tricks to using the technology. And as we just experienced here, there's always some glitches, or often glitches, with using technology, and people's software, their computers crash, or they don't have very good internet connection, and there's different procedures for conducting the test. So the test publisher should have procedures for training proctors to administer the test virtually. And then the final minimal thing that we look for virtual testing is the technology requirements should be spelled out, and that students who will be taking the test should be able to have that technology to administer the test. So as I said, I know some test publishers, I believe Best Plus has already come out with some guidelines about this, and we've been talking to the other publishers and expect them to, within the next few weeks, you'll be hearing from them about virtual testing if you haven't already. So that's our new thing. The final thing that sometimes happens, as we just experienced, there's an interruption in the testing, or you have to reboot. something like that. You don't want to, there has to be some procedures for what to do in that situation. Either you start the test all over again or take off from where you crashed or some way to do it. So those are the 5 things that we look for that we've asked the publishers to address, which they will be addressing about how to do a virtual test. NRS approved, and then identify the participant, a way to maintain security, training of test proctors, the technology you need, and procedures for retesting. Okay, so that was a lot of information all at once. So let me just summarize the 2 of the key things that you want to remember. For reporting of distance learners, you can count the participant either as a distance learner or traditional classroom learner, but they have to only be counted as in that category once. And once they're in that category, they're counted that way for each POP. You have to report the initial 12 contact hours on NRS tables 4 and C, at 4 and 4C, which is the distance learning breakout. And that's the same as all other participants. And if you're using proxy hours, which is optional, you also report those in those 2 tables. Highly recommended by Octave that you have a distance learning policy where you define how you're going to identify distance learners. If you're using proxy hours, what the methods you're using and how they're relevant for the curriculum you're using, how you're determining post-testing time, and what your testing procedures are, and they can be, again, virtual or in person. Once you, I know many of states are going to be implementing the virtual testing, so that should be spelled out in your policy. So here's some specifics about the COVID-19 pandemic that come out of Octave Program Memorandum 24, which was released on Friday, just a couple days ago. You can revise your assessment policy for distance education to exempt them from testing if testing is not possible due to the pandemic. And what you want to put in that policy in that revision is the time frame where this exemption is taking place. So for example, at the start of when the pandemic started to affect you, for example, in your state, to June 30th, the rest of this program year. So you want to put that time frame of the start and ending, and maybe it won't go all the way to June 30th, but whatever the end date is, but no later than June 30th. The guidelines you're using to identify who is exempt, and so you want to put that in your revised policy. If you're using revising the current policy that expires this program year on June 30th, you do not need prior Octave approval to make those changes. And so take a look at the Program Memorandum 24 for more information about that. And that memorandum also addresses a few other things not directly related to distance learning. Okay, well, a few other things to keep in mind as far as reporting. You want to report, we're asking you to report the number of participants who were not able to be tested in their narrative report under question 2 for PY 2019. So keep an unduplicated count of the number of participants who could not be tested due to the pandemic and put that in the narrative report under question 2. So in that way, we have an idea of how the scope of that issue when evaluating and looking at MSG and pre and post testing rates for 2019. Again, you don't need to get prior approval for assessment policies for this program year. From the last program memorandum in 23, Octave has said in that memorandum that it will not make any determination of performance, success, or failure based on 2019 performance for the data that will be submitted for this program year on October 1st. There'll be some other guidance forthcoming on testing from Octave in the near future. And as they and we at the NRS project are being very responsive to questions you have, because we're getting a lot of questions about that. So as they come in, they're evaluated, and eventually Octave will make a proficient announcement. And I have some resources at the end summarizing where all of those resources are. So now we have quite a bit of time still for questions. So Marcella, do you see any questions for me here?
Yes, we got quite a few. So I'm going to try to go back up and make sure we get them all covered. Sorry, just a minute. Let's see. Second. So the first question we received is credit completion only for ABE and only for levels 5 and 6?
No, it is, well, you just follow the same definitions as normal. So for example, if you're looking at, for MSG, no, you can just get let's say the participant gets a GED or passes a test for the secondary credential, they can be counted as achieving that credential, and that can be counted as an MSG. It isn't limited to ABE or ESL or a particular level. You may be thinking of the credential indicator, which has some more restrictions. But for MSG, no, it's not limited to level or ABE or ESL.
Great. Another question we received asked, will the virtual testing continue for rural students after centers are reopened?
Yeah, we're seeing the virtual testing now is not just a one-time thing or a short-term thing. It will be part of distance learning policy from now on. I think we still have to work out a little bit about the virtual testing requirements, which we'll think about in the coming months. But right now, because of sort of the emergency situation, we're just as long as the test publisher comes up with a sensible plan that covers those areas, we're just allowing that. But we don't think it's going to end. I think now that we've started virtual testing, we will continue that in the future.
Great. Another question we received says, we are heavily locked into a minimal number of hours before post-testing. Can you elaborate on switching to a number of weeks and how we might gauge an appropriate amount of time?
Yeah, I suppose when a student has switched, I guess that would be difficult to say generally, but I would say that the first thing you need to do is decide if you're going to now change the status of that student to be a virtual learner. So that would be just for reporting, really. And then to do that, you should follow your state definition. But then to do the testing, what I guess you could do is, I would recommend doing is count the number of hours that maybe the participant already had in face-to-face learning, and then determine either one of those models or a way to do it. As long as so either you could say, okay, now we're switching to, for example, some software where we have established proxy hours, and we'll switch to that and then accrue the hours that way. Or if it's brand new, I think you need to come up, like you've never done proxy hours before and you're not really sure how to do it. Given the relatively quick time frame, I would just recommend developing a procedure and adding that to your assessment policy. So make sure whatever you do is sensible and sticks to the requirements, and it's written down in a policy. So come up with another way using the proxy models or maybe a calendar model to do that. So I would recommend doing that. I don't know, Cheryl or Jay, do you have something to add to that? It's switching over to like that. We have to unmute, guys.
Can you hear me? This is Jay.
Yeah, Jay, we hear you.
Yeah, Jay,
we
can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think, Larry, what you covered was pretty much what I would have said. We have those 3 models for proxy hours, and I think picking one that actually is appropriate for, first of all, thinking about the curriculum that's being used and making sure that the model that you're selecting for your state is appropriate to the curriculum that's being used, and that, like you also said, and also, by the way, I just want to mention that you're not locked into just one of those three models. You could be using several types of platforms or a curriculum that's appropriate for one model and a curriculum that might be appropriate for a different model. And so you might be using more than one of those models. But like you said, Larry, I think it would be, this is a very important point, to make sure that it's documented in your assessment policy, in the distance education portion of your assessment policy.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. Jay. Okay.
Another question
Yeah.
another question we had was about a PowerPoint presentation being emailed to attendees, and I believe we'll have it available on the NRS website as soon as we're able. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we'll have it on the website.
Okay. Yeah. The next question says, just to confirm, in the first POP, participants are counted as distance or traditional learners, and designation from first POP is used for all subsequent POPs?
Yes, that's correct. So let's say they're a distance learner once and then they come back and they're not. You still you count them, and for reporting purposes, you just count them in table 4C, basically. And so yes, once you have that status for the year, you always have that status.
Okay. Someone asked for some clarity regarding Octave Memo 20-4. Are states being given the flexibility to enroll students in programs without a valid assessment or pretest?
Yes, you are. You do have that flexibility during the pandemic time for this the rest of this time. But you must ensure eligibility of the student, so that the student is eligible for AFLA.
So can folks hear me now? Did I come through? I've been having a problem with my speakers. It's Cheryl.
Oh.
Okay,
Hi,
yeah.
Cheryl.
So John, if I can address that.
Hi, Cheryl.
First, I want to point out that common practice is for states to use an NRS approved test to determine eligibility for a student, for a new student, and that's fine to do that. However, now that many programs are operating solely on a distance basis, I want to point out that it is not now, nor never has been, a requirement that eligibility is determined using an NRS approved pretest or an NRS approved test. Local programs, as a state person, and local programs, of course, are required to due diligence to determine that a student is eligible for AFLA services. So you can determine eligibility in different ways, and states may want to give guidance in how they want programs to determine eligibility, absent the ability to administer a standardized test. But it's not a requirement for eligibility. It never has been a requirement for eligibility. But now that you cannot use an NRS approved test, you can use other means to determine their eligibility. That's not a problem.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Nancy Olson, hi Nancy, asked to the number of reported, you should report number who are not pre-tested or not post-tested, or just not post-tested in the narrative. I would count both. I would say here both of them. I would say here's the number we couldn't pre-test, and here's the number that we couldn't post-test, but make sure it's an unduplicated count. So, for example, this 50 students were not able to pre and post-test it, and et cetera. So I would put both of those in your narrative report. Okay, and Sharon Parkers asks, hi Sharon, student attended 12 hours of service and now they've switched to distance learning. Should be counting them as traditional or distance, given that regardless of whether the student got 50% of hours. we're going to leave that up to the states to determine how you want to do that. You can say keep the 50% rule. You could say someone who's suddenly switched and now is distanced for the rest of the year. But whatever you do, put it in your policy and apply it consistently. Remember, that designation is really just for pulling it out in Table 4C, so it doesn't have a great impact on your performance or reporting because everyone goes into Table 4 anyway. And so pulling it into 4C is just a way we look at distance learners separately. So whatever you do, put it in your policy and make sure that's applied consistently. Next one is Cheryl Hart, the initial 12 hours have to be done first before allowing proxy hours. No, you can immediately start to count proxy hours from day one if you want to do that. Remember, the 12 hours can be any combination of contact. So if you want to say, you have an assignment you'd say it takes 12 hours to complete, let's say in one of the models, as long as it's appropriate to your curriculum and you have that in your policy, then you can certainly do that. You don't have to wait to count proxy hours. Next one. Questions about LACIS, and I don't really know how LACIS is doing that, but I'll defer that. I won't answer that because I don't really know how LACIS is handling that. Let's see.
It looks like the next question is from John. Oh, I don't know if that was a question. It says, as we prepare for our virtual enrollment process, we have a proposal in lieu of obtaining physical student signatures for release of information. And he provided an example of something there. Are other states using an electronic signature service that has a mobile-friendly interface?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe if some of you are using that, you can tell John or John Anderson. What else? Are we supposed to be having? No. Yeah, just looking through some comments about all the noise that was there.
It seems like Cheryl is trying to speak, but I'm so sorry, Cheryl, I can't hear you.
No, that was from before. I was muted out. I had to call back in, so I'm on now, and I can hear. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so Terry Tackett is asking a question we are grappling with right now, Cheryl, and that's if you don't have a pretest, how do you place them in an NRS table for educational functioning level? And the answer to that is we're thinking about how to do that. We haven't made a determination yet. Anything else to add, Jay or Cheryl?
No, I mean, it is the most next logical question that we're looking at things to try to figure out what the workaround is, but we have not been able to address it yet. Soon come.
Soon come, yeah. And remember, you have to count students in the tables. The exemption is for tests, not having to test, but we have to figure out a way to count them because everyone has to be counted in Table 4. So it's not an exemption from reporting, it's just an exemption from testing. So make sure you count all your students as you always have. And once we figure out how to count students that aren't pre-tested, we'll let you know. I see several comments about technical issues.
Larry,
about that. Yes, Jay.
I see a question from Michelle Johnson, and I think you might have started to answer that or actually answered it. Does this mean that those students can be counted for NRS purposes? And we have gotten this question over the past couple of days since the NRS TIPS document was released. And the requirement is that any participant in the program who receives 12 or more hours of service under the AFLA grant must be reported on the NRS tables. So that includes students who have, if your state assessment policy has been revised to exempt due to the COVID pandemic, to exempt students from post-testing or to enroll students in the program without pre-testing. Those students that have been exempted from pre or post-testing or both, if they've received 12 or more hours of services and qualify as a participant in the program, by virtue of having achieved those hours, they need to be reported on the NRS tables. I just wanted to clarify that, make that a little more clear. So I thought that might be part of what Michelle was asking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for clarifying,
Thank you.
Jay. Michelle, is that, you can type yes or no in there if you want more information. Excuse me. We have several more questions. Let me find one.
We had one question from Kathy who says, so a student doesn't have a pretest, gets 12 hours of distance learning, and that's all we count. Do we receive credit for an MSG if the student obtains another gain?
Yes, you can
credential
count
attainment
MSG.
or transition to post-secondary.
Right. Yes, you can count MSG if a student gets, as you can with any other participant, if they enter post-secondary education after exit or get a secondary credential equivalent, and the other ways of getting MSG, yes, you can count that as an MSG. But you don't have to have a post-test.
I'll go back and clarify a little bit more, if I may. So
sure.
To get an educational functioning level gain under MSG, you can get it by getting a sufficient score on a pre and post test, or if the student is enrolled in a credit-bearing program that's recognized by the state, they could get an MSG by completing credits, or if the student leaves the program and enters post-secondary education, you can get an educational functioning level gain. You can also get an educational functioning level gain by obtaining a high school diploma. So if you have a student enrolled in a high school prep program in distance and you're not able to pre and post test and that student gets his diploma, you can also get an EFL. So there are all the ways that you can legitimately count a measurable skill gain under those types of gains under that indicator.
Right, and I put that slide up there that described that. And we have a few questions about how are we going to do this how do we place a student in a level without a pretest? But again, that's something that will be, information about that will be forthcoming. So we'll tell you how to do that.
Larry, I just wanted to know, we're about to run out of space in the chat because we have such great questions. I'm going to ask that everybody please use the new chat box that I used so that we don't lose any of your questions.
Oh, I was wondering what that was. Thank you.
I've never experienced that, but
yeah, okay.
Something new.
Okay, what else do we have? Well, here's an interesting question. Can you exempt participants and test them once virtual testing is set up? Yeah, yes, you can. Of course, if they've exited, you won't be able to after a certain period of time, I guess. But yes. So if you change your mind, let's say you're saying, oh, we're not going to post test them, and then a couple of weeks from now there's a test, you can go back and test them. Again, I would document whatever you do in your policy so we know if there's some situation like that.
So Kathy Olson-Tracy is still having some outstanding questions. Kathy, if you reach out to us afterwards, we can have a conversation to clarify what you're having trouble with.
Yes, and anyone else who's having difficulty with the questions, or tech issues, which I've seen a number are here, please do just send us emails either to me or Alan or someone from Octave. or Jay?
Yeah, Larry, this is Jay. It seems that people who have called in on a phone are not having any audio issues or tech issues. People who have joined the webinar through just computer only seem to be having those issues.
Yeah.
So we are telling them the webinar has been recorded so that they can go, and everybody who is having the technology issues could go in and hear the complete webinar.
Right.
I did want to address a question I see here. I see a question here from, I believe, Terry Tackett. He says he understands that we need to count all clients that have 12 hours, but at current point, the systems may not have a way to record how and where we enter those clients. Is that to come? So that's a question that is unique, I think, to the state's data system. I'm not, the reason I wanted to address this question is that, Terry, I don't think I understand why your system, are you saying you don't have proxy hours in place and that's why you can't yet track the hours to see if they've reached the 12-hour mark? So probably what I think would be best to do is just for Terry, for you to contact our team and get in touch with us, and we'll talk about your specific situation with your data system.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Suddenly they stopped.
We have hours.
A lot of technical problems, which I
Oh,
apologize.
Terry has clarified his question. His question is the same as the one we saw previously, which is they do have a way to track the hours. They just don't know where to place the student on the NRS table if they enroll the student without a pretest. And Terry, as we said earlier, we're working on an answer to that question.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, Michelle Johnson, you can't hear her. I don't know. Sorry.
There's a new question in the box from Rebecca Ellis. Can we provide devices to students so that they can get pre and post test? It seems hard to provide equitable access to students when some have technology needed at home and others do not. So I think the access to technology is one of the really hot issues in distance learning. And certainly it would impede a state's ability to conduct the level of virtual testing once that becomes available, because there will be technology needs. We don't have an answer on how we can provide equitable access to technology to our students, but it is the issue of the day, and we're having conversations with people, and we're trying to learn more about what some strategies and solutions are in the state so that we can share with others.
And Tom,
And Nancy,
Nancy, yes, go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say Nancy asked about being in contact with MIS vendors about the exemptions.
No, I have not been. We've been in contact with test publishers, but not with MIS vendors.
I want to clarify.
I don't know if you.
I'm sorry. I want to also clarify that we're asking you to give us your best idea on how many exemptions were provided through your policies due to the pandemic in your narrative report. We're not asking for a entry of a new data element. And so, I mean, if you can accommodate it in your MIS to get it, that would be fine. But if you need less formal methods for your programs to be able to record those numbers, that's okay to do also. I don't want to suggest that every MIS needs to be adjusted to track exemptions, because hopefully these exemptions are going to be temporary. We just want to be able to clarify to people who use our data exactly how many students we think were exempted. So please don't take this that every MIS has to be adjusted to collect exemption numbers. Most states currently have exemptions in their policies, and they have different ways, different filing requirements, different ways that they're asking local programs to track any exemptions that they would do. So I just wanted to clarify that we are not requiring you to change your MISs. We are asking to track to the best of your ability the number of exemptions only for the purpose of being able to provide some clarification when our MSG rates decline because of inability to test.
Okay, so Sarah's saying we still need to be able to track who we tested and who we didn't. Yes, that is true. And I hope you have a way of doing that in your MIS. I don't know what else to say about that. And Tom says in Virginia they have a EFL estimator. That's interesting. Okay, and there's a little discussion going on about that between them. Okay, we have about a couple minutes if there's any more questions. If not, Michelle, could you advance down the slide deck to the end? Oh, here we go. I saw it.
Yeah, hold on just one second. I can jump us ahead.
Oh, not that far. Okay, 5 minutes, but if there's no more questions, I'll just review. Here's where you can get the program memorandum, particularly part 3 and 4. And of course, as I said, all of this, with the exception of the virtual testing, which we're adding right now, is already in the NRS TA guide on pages 23, 46, and 48. And a week or so ago, we developed this NRS tips on distance ed, which summarizes just about everything that was in this PowerPoint. And I did email that to all the state directors, and you can get it on the website. Okay, just looking. And we'll also, as Marcella said, we'll be putting this presentation and the PowerPoint on the website in the next couple of days. And please do email us if you have any further questions, NRS Web or myself or Jay, anyone at Opte, and we will answer your questions. And we have some more information soon coming from Opte, so look out for that. And thank you and best wishes to everyone. Stay healthy and happy, and we'll be online again soon. Thank you very much.